Today we are continuing section 4.6. We are going to be factoring polynomials with what we call a leading coefficient. So we're looking at something like 2m squared minus m minus 1. Yesterday we did problems like this: x squared minus 5x plus 6. So notice that the difference here is that there is a number other than 1 in front of the squared term. So when that happens, we have to do a couple of extra steps. So example number 1. So using this same problem, 2m squared minus m minus 1, right? Step number 1 is to take the leading coefficient and multiply it times the constant. And so you're going to get 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And then you take your coefficient of the m term, which is negative 1. Now we do exactly what we did yesterday. What multiplies to negative 2 but adds up to negative 1. So it's going to be a negative 2 and a positive 1. Negative 2 times positive 1 gives us our negative 2, and negative 2 plus positive 1 gives us our negative 1. Now, here's the second thing that's different. This negative m came from adding these two together. So now we just put back what it was. So we do 2m squared minus 2m plus 1m minus 1. So if I add these two together, it's still negative 1m. So I haven't really changed anything. And now what we do, notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So remember from yesterday, when we have 4 terms, we group 2 terms together, hopefully in such a way that the 2 terms have something in common. Okay, so we're going to group the 4 terms that way. Then in the first parenthesis, is there anything in common? Is there a common factor? The common factor is 2m, so we factor that out, and that leaves us m minus 1. Then in the second parenthesis, the only common factor is a 1, so we factor out a 1. Okay, now we have 2 terms. We have this term and we have this term. And the common factor in each one of those terms is m minus 1, so we factor that out. And what's left over? The 2m plus 1, and we put those in parentheses. Okay? And normally we would write that like this. Okay? And we see, just a quick check, if we FOIL this back out, 2m times m is 2m squared. 2m times negative 1 is negative 2m. 1 times m is 1m. And 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. Then I get 2m squared minus m minus 1. Exactly what I started with. So we do have the correct answer. So this is our answer. Okay? All right, so let's try another one. Example 2. 6c squared minus 5c plus 1. Okay, so step number 1, when you see the leading coefficient, you multiply it times the n number. Well, actually, remember the first step is to look for common factors, and I did that mentally, and there weren't any. That's why I went straight to the 6 times 1. Make your x, you get 6, and then you take your negative 5 and put it on the bottom. Then you do exactly what we did yesterday. What times what is a positive 6 but adds up to negative 5? So it's going to be negative 2 and negative 3. Negative 2 times negative 3 is a positive 6. Negative 2 plus negative 3 is a negative 5. Now remember, what we do is we take this and replace it with what it came from. So 6c squared, and the negative 5c came from a negative 2c and a negative 3c. Now we group. So I put 6c squared minus 2c in one parenthesis, plus, in the other parenthesis I put negative 3c plus 1. Notice that I kept the sign that was in front of the 3 with the 3. Okay? Now, in the first parenthesis, the common factor. So in this parenthesis, the common factor is, think to yourself what it would be. It's 2c. And if I take 2c from this, that leaves me just 3c. And if I take 2c from this, I need to put a 1 as a placeholder. Then, notice that this is a negative 3c. We can't have a negative there, so we factor out a negative 1. And actually, negative 1 is the only common factor there. So that changes that to 3c minus 1. And we factor out the negative 1. Now, notice we have a common factor of 3c minus 1. So we factor that out. And what's left? 2c minus 1. Okay, and again, you can quickly mentally check that by doing FOIL. We get 6c squared minus 3c minus 2c plus 1. And that does add up. So we did factor this correctly. This is our final answer. Okay, number 3. If I have 2n squared plus 9n minus 18, okay, are there any common factors? Is there any number that divides each one of these terms? And no, there isn't. 2 divides the first term and 2 divides the last term, but it doesn't divide the middle term. So then we proceed. There's 3 terms, and so that means we're going to go to our x, and because there's a leading coefficient, we're going to multiply that times the n number. So 2 times negative 18 gives us negative 36, and then we have 9. So then we ask ourselves, what times what is a negative 36 but adds up to a positive 9? Well, it's going to be a positive, it's going to be a negative, a positive 12 and a negative 3. Let's see if that works. Positive 12 times negative 3 is a negative 36, and positive 12 plus negative 3 is a positive 9. Okay? Now, remember that now we replace the middle term with what it came from. So it's going to be 2n squared plus 12n minus 3n minus 18. Again, notice that if you add these two together, it does add up to that. Okay, but we don't want to do that. We want to group them in groups of 2. And notice again, I'm keeping the negative with the 3, with the negative 3n. Okay? Now, in the first parenthesis, what are the common factors? Each term has a 2, each term has an n. So factor that out. Right? In the second parenthesis, each term has a negative 3. So we're going to factor out a negative 3. So that's going to leave us n plus 6. Okay, now notice that we have a common factor now of n plus 6. So we factor that out. And what's left over? 2n minus 3. So that goes in a parenthesis. Okay, and again, in the book, the answer would probably be written like this, but either way is correct. Okay. right? Let's try example 4. Okay, we have 3z squared plus 10z plus 3. Okay, there's no common factors. There's 3 terms, so that means we're going to go to our x. And there's a leading coefficient, so we're going to multiply that times the constant. And we're going to take our middle number. Then what multiplies to 9 but adds up to 10? 9 and 1. Now we replace the middle term with what it came from. Okay, and again, notice that if I add these two together, it adds up to that. Right, but now the next step, think to yourself, what do I do next? Okay, the next thing is to group. Okay, look at the first parenthesis. The common factor is 3z. So that leaves me a z plus 3. And in the second parenthesis, this one, the only common factor there is a 1. So I factor out a 1. Okay, now the common factor is z plus 3. And what's left over? 3z plus 1. And there are our factors. All right, now let's try this one. 5r squared minus 10r plus 7. So no common factors. There are 3 terms, so I go to the x. I have a leading coefficient, so I multiply that times the constant. Gives me 35. Then, are there any numbers that multiply to 35 but add up to negative 10? Well, the only factors of 35 are 5 and 7. And so, if they're both positive, they add up to 12. Whoops, 5 plus 7. So that's not 10. If one's negative, that adds up to negative 2. If the other one's negative, it adds up to a positive 2. So there are no numbers that work. So this one is prime. All right, let's do one more, number 6. 2x squared minus 11x minus 21. Right, step number 1, any common factors? No. Step number 2, how many terms? There's 3, so that means I'm going to do the x. Then think to yourself, what would you do next? Right, you have a leading coefficient, so you multiply that times the n number. So 2 times 21 gives you 42, and then you have a negative 11. Then what times what is 40? Positive 42, but adds up to a negative 11. Now sometimes it takes a while, sometimes you have to break it down. And 2 times 7 is 14, and 14 and 3 have a difference of 11. So let's try 14 and 3. And which one needs to be negative? This one does. Okay. Now, what do I do next? Think to yourself, what would be the next step? Correct. We replace this with what it came from. Then the next step, what would that be? Right, you group. Then look for common factors in the grouping. So 2x is the common factor in the first parenthesis, so I get x minus 7. 3 is the common factor in the second parenthesis. Now what is the common factor? Right, the common factor is x minus 7. And what's left over? 2x plus 3.